Let's talk about knitting styles. Now, let's start with Western. Now, Western style includes continental, which is also called picking, throwers, which is also called English style. It can also include lever knitting, which is basically the same as a thrower. They're just not taking their right hand off their needle as they're knitting. So, there's a lot of variations of the Western style. So for the Western style, no matter if you're a continental knitter or you're an English style knitter, you enter the yarn to knit from the front, right there. You're going to travel to the left. Now, as you see I'm wrapping it in a counterclockwise direction. So we knit Western style counterclockwise. So I'm going to do a few stitches like a thrower. And just to make the pickers out there happy in the world, go ahead and do a couple stitches continental style. All right. Now, let's look at the stitches. You can see clearly the line is still there. You see it? We can see where, as we knitted it, it added twist. So it kept that chain-like structure in the yarn. So let's just purl back for funsies, shall we? So again, when we think about Western style purling, we are wrapping over, which is counterclockwise. So, and you can see it's retaining that chain shape to the ply. Get through this. So you can see clearly stitches are separate bits, and you can see again the lines that form the chain or the ply. So let's talk about Eastern knitting. Now you can find Eastern knitting places like Russia and across Europe. It's just a different style. So for Eastern knitting, you're going to stick, again, your needle in the same way to knit, but instead of going counterclockwise like this, which would be Western style, you're going to go clockwise. So I'm going to knit a few stitches here so we can see in comparison what it's doing. Now look at this. Down here are some examples of the Western style because I just haven't knitted those yet. Those are my left needle. Here are the Eastern stitches. And you can see what's happening is it's taking the twist out. So it's breaking those stitches up. Now these I could make it more easy to split when I go back through them. In comparison, these you can see are more tightly bound together. I really have to get in there to split them apart. So you can see that Eastern style is taking out the twist in this particular yarn. I'm going to knit the rest of this row, Eastern style, and then I'm going to turn to purl, Eastern style. So, like normal, my yarn's in the front, I stick my needle up here. Now, instead of our normal, in the Western world, counterclockwise, I'm going to go clockwise. So I'm going this way. You can also think of this as taking the yarn under your needle to purl, or the Eastern purl. So if we can remember, this yarn likes to move in the counterclockwise direction. So when I knit it, it's a real good example. Going clockwise, it removes twist from the yarn and separates it. So do you see now it had the separate pieces versus the lines that we could clearly see was applied. So it's taking the twist out of the yarn. Now, let's try one more experiment. Let's try what's called a combination style. So I'm going to knit this row. For a combination style, we combines Western versus, or I should say Western knit and the Eastern purl. The easiest way to think about this is the yarn goes underneath the needle for both knitting and purling. So what does that mean? So for the knit stitch, I'm going to go counterclockwise. Remember, the yarn likes to go that direction. And then I'm going to purl the next two, which I'm going to be going the clockwise direction, which this yarn's not a fan of. Two. Let me do two here. Two. I can't remember the right direction I just did that one. Let me back that up. Oops. Do you ever get lost in a row? Knit, purl, knit. Purl. Now I'm trying not to dice this yarn because, again, when I was knitting that Eastern style, it took the twist out of the yarn. Oops, and under. Because I'm not trying to split the yarn. There. Okay, I'm going to do one more row. Make it easier to see. So for the combination, you knit the Western style and you purl Eastern. So when looking at this, you can see where the knit and the purl stitches are. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So you've got where you can see the purl definitely opens it up, where the knit keeps it nice and together. So when we're looking at this, this will have an effect on the overall piece. Now I'm going to get to some samples in a moment where I've knitted more of the Eastern style, Western style, and the combination so you can see the differences between them. But let's take that into account. So this yarn likes to go counterclockwise. So it's probably best when we're looking at it, you can see for that Western style knitter. Keeps things nice and tight together. You can see it. This is where the Eastern is about, and you can see where it opens it up, which might be good if you're trying to fill some things in, but I could see where cables or lace, where you might want to have some definition, it's going to kind of make it a little swampy, a little harder to see. In combination style knitter, this is what could make a very interesting rib pattern, because it opens up the yarn in one sense and closes it or tightens it in the other. So this could be excellent for cables and for some lace, depending on how much purling and decreases and increases where they're falling. So where you can really see the difference between the different styles in a moment. So I'm going to put this to the side. So remember, this yarn likes to go counterclockwise. Let's take a look at a yarn that likes to go clockwise. So check. As I go counterclockwise, you see it starts to split apart. I move my hands to the right, which would be clockwise, and you can see it adds twist back in. So English knitters and Western knitters and combination knitters, start your engines. So again, Western style, I go counterclockwise. So counterclockwise. I'm going to knit a row. Watch what happens as I'm knitting. So you can see the actual definition right through there of the ply. When I put it over, yeah, do you see that? It took the twist right out and it's opening it. Let's see that again. So you can see yarn to start off with has the twist in it. I come around and knit. Yes. Do you see how it opened that right up? So this yarn may not be the best for someone who is a Western style knitter, unless, again, like this sample, you are using it for a specific reason. So you want to open and expand that area up. So let's look at the Western style purl. So again, I go counterclockwise, and you can see it removes twist, so it opens that yarn up. Yes, do you see it taking it right out? So here are a few more purl stitches in Western style. Now, if that wasn't thrilling enough, I'm telling you. But you can see it really opens, and you can really see the individual plies that are coming together to form those stitches. Now, in comparison, let's do a little Eastern. So remember Western, I go counter. For Eastern, I go clockwise when I knit. So I'm going to knit. Now, as I knit, check this out. So you see the yarn, and I'm going to pull it up and through. Do you see how it retains that twist? Look at that. Do you see how it keeps that twist? Interesting, isn't it? So here is my Eastern knit. Now let's try the Eastern purl. So normally Western, we go counter. Eastern goes clockwise. So you can think of this as putting the yarn under the needle And you can see again, as I put the yarn underneath here, it retains its ply structure. It doesn't separate the plies. So this twist works well with the the Eastern style knitting. So that is what my pearl looks like. And you can see in comparison, it retained the plies in it. Now, what happens with combination style knitting? Let's find out. So I am going to knit Western style, which is counterclockwise. So that does what? That will open that up. So let's do 2. And then I'm going to purl Eastern style. So think of that as the yarns going under. So that will add twist to this particular yarn. Now you can start to see that already, where you can see these two are much looser, much more open, and these two are much tighter together. So let's keep going. So I knit Western, I knit Western, I purl English, or Eastern, excuse me, purl Eastern. 2 E words are just, and the last 2, knit Western, knit Western. Come back this direction. So we can do a quick comparison. Eastern, or excuse me, Western, Western, Eastern, Eastern. For this one, the easiest way to think about combination knitting is the yarn's always going underneath the needle. So let's look at it. So you can see where it opens the twist and closes the twist and opens the twist and closes the twist. So you can see, especially here, you can see all the different plies, because these are the 2 knit. And here are the purls. Do you see how much tighter those are in comparison? So here's the knits again, and here are the purls. And you can really see on the front end of the stitches too. So again, this might be good for some cables, something that you might want to define a certain type of texture and open up a different section, because the purling is going to, again, add twist, so make the yarn a little tighter. When you go in the opposite direction, it's going to open it up and make the yarn a little bit looser. So I'm going to go through a sample again of what this one looks like in a little bit. So let's look at some samples. So here I have the Western style. Here is my Eastern style, and here's my combination style. Now I'm going to look at each one of these more closely. So let's start with the Barocco. Now, if we can remember from our little sample here, when we twist it to the right or counterclockwise, it adds twist to the yarn. So if we can remember, this is the Western style knitting, which, remember, when we knit Western style, we are knitting counterclockwise. So you can see in this sample, it has a nice defined stitch where we can see the ridges of those plies quite clearly. Looks quite good, doesn't it? So what does the Western and Eastern look like in comparison? So here are the Eastern and Western right next to each other. Let's take a closer look at the Eastern. So here's the Eastern style. Now you can see the plies are much easier to see because they're separated. Where instead of the lines being more going one direction, they're just kind of flat and open. And the stitch has kind of separated into its parts, components. So you can see, here's what they look like side by side. So you can see this particular yarn makes this look much more uniformed, much cleaner kind of looking visually. Where you see the typical Western line. This, it kind of muddies the water, doesn't it? Where it's opened some of those stitches up and there's not really a defined stitch. It's just kind of here or there. So what does it look like in the combination? So remember the combination, we knit Western style and then we purl our Eastern style purl. So in comparison, you can see where we have these very similar, nicely defined knit stitches. But right below them, you will see the purl stitches which have opened up. So here's the purl, here's the purl row. We have the nice definition, but then it kind of muddies the water underneath there. So this might be good. Combination style with this particular twist when you want to add definition to a particular part of a stitch pattern. So if you want to kind of emphasize the knit stitches and de-emphasize the purl stitches in a particular pattern, this might be a good option. This twist yarn, which was preferred counterclockwise, with a combination style. You see how it makes one set of stitches kind of rise above and the other set of stitches kind of sit further back behind. It gives you kind of a 3D little effect. So another curious factor is what happens and what do they look like from behind. So here is the basic Western style from behind. Here is the Eastern style from behind the scenes, as well as combination style. So let's take a look at these a little bit more closely too. So you can see kind of characteristic of the basic Western stockinette, where we have the lines, and you can see it's really nicely defined, where we can see the stitches. They're clearly defined. And we can see where it looks as one piece. It doesn't look like separate parts. In comparison, you can see where this has kind of gotten a little bit muddied. And it almost gives you a garter, like a faux garter, like row in between the stitches. Because remember, for Eastern style, we are going clockwise, which opens that up. So you can see stitches are, in comparison, less defined than that Eastern style. It just opens that up because we're taking twist out of the yarn. So when we're looking at the combo, you can see too, again here, where it emphasizes that one and kind of muddies the water on the other. So you can see where we have the nice knit row, and then it gets a little bit muddied when we have the purl row underneath it. So this is the example of the Barocco vintage, which likes a counterclockwise stitch direction. So you can check them out one last time. Let's talk about the sample that preferred, again, if I go counterclockwise, it took the twist out of the yarn and makes it separate. If I go clockwise, it adds twist to the yarn. So this particular Egyptian cotton likes that clockwise, or the clockwise spin adds twist to it. So in our Western sample, which remember when we knit Western, we're knitting counterclockwise, you can see where the stitches are very open. It's really pulled apart that texture of the yarn. So instead of the yarn having this really nice tight texture, in that we see the individual pieces of it instead. So I can see where all of the plies have come together to make the yarn. And it's just kind of gotten big and fat and kind of just loose. In comparison to the Barocco Vintage, you can see where there's some very specific, it's not holes per se, but where the stitches are very defined. Where this, the stitches are just kind of fat, open. There's not really much definition for them. So let's look in comparison to the Eastern sample now. Now remember, Eastern is going clockwise, which this yarn likes. So in comparison, we can see where these stitches are very well defined. So here's our knit stitch. I'm not dicing it with this tiny little DPN. So we can see they're much more defined. And again, there's not any tension on the sample. You can see I'm not pulling it apart. It's just nice and defined. In comparison to the Western style, you can see where it's just kind of, where everything is just muddied. It's all running into each other. Where the Eastern gives much better stitch definition here between the stitches. So what is it like in the combination style? So this kind of gives you a funky texture, which could be really fun to work with. So again, very similar to, I will say, the Barocco, where it kind of gave you this fun little detail. This one gives you that same, but in a different way. So you can see where, again, the top part is a little bit more muddied. The bottom part is better defined. So in comparison to the Barocco, which had the top, because the Barocco liked that Western style knitting, so you can see the top is very defined. And the purl stitch, which was the Eastern style, is much more muddied. In this one, you can see where, again, here's the Western style, much, much more muddied. But here is that Eastern purl. Eastern purl is much better defined in the rows. So this could be one where you want to emphasize the purl or the back portion of that stitch pattern and de-emphasize this other section to give it kind of more of the 3D or textured appearance. So what do these also look like from behind? Let's flip them over. So here is the Western sample. Eastern sample. and my combo. So you can even see kind of the details and stitches from the back side of the stockinette sample. So again, you can see where this has just gotten muddied because it's become more open. Now also when wearing something like this that's a little more open, it's much easier to snag things on it. So it's easier to snag those little bits and pieces. Now here is that Eastern style where you can see it's much better defined between the stitches. And then here's that combination style, which kind of gives you a fun little chain-like appearance. Because again, it's much more defined in the purl and then not as defined because of the Eastern style knit that was used. So you have your Eastern style knit, you can see it just gets muddied. And then you have these very clearly defined rows. Muddied, clearly defined, muddied, clearly defined. So it's really in how you want your sample or your finished project to look. Let's compare both yarns now. Okay, so here are samples side by side. Here is your Western, Eastern, and the combination. So the Baracco Vintage, remember, likes the counterclockwise twist. So we could see clearly it was much easier to define the stitches and looked much cleaner in the Western style knitting than in the Eastern style, which just kind of left it a little muddy. Contrastingly, here is the Egyptian cotton, which preferred the clockwise twist, which looked much better, or much more defined, not better, but the definition was just distinctly different in the Eastern style than in the Western, which just became, whereas more bits and pieces, is easier to snag. And there. Now, knock that out. Okay. Then we have the combination, which this is interesting. So depending on the style you would like, whether you wanted to emphasize the top portion or the knit in the Western style, de-emphasize the purl in the Eastern style, or if you wanted to flip that. Because remember, this one over here preferred the clockwise direction, which was the Eastern, versus the Western. So that's why you can see where it looks like that one section is muddied, that top section, or the section that's closest to you, muddied, where at this side, it looks a little bit more clearly defined. So it's just more in the style of what you want your project or finished project to look like. But here are just some examples of how the yarn twist matters and the style in which you knit it. And don't forget also about our little single sample here too. So remember our single sample, where this became much more open, much more broad, because this particular yarn, again, like that clockwise twist, became much better defined stitches where you can really see the definition between them in the Eastern style. And then here's that combination style again, where you have, again, that purl is very defined, and then that Western style, the stitch on the top gets muddied. But you can see it makes it almost a neat little herringbone-like design there. So yarn twist and your style of knitting matters. So next time when you go yarn shopping, check to see which direction that yarn twists. One way you can find out, of course, is by twisting the yarn, or you can check out yarnsub.com, which gives some, I will say on some yarns, it will tell you the twist direction of the ply. But Happy knitting!